again, in your virtual conference pack, you will find a conference discount for the Routledge Companion to Gender and Science Fiction. Forget the title. Sorry. But it's all in there. Lisa is an extremely renowned writer and anthologist of books such as Galactic Suburbia, and more recently, The Future is Female anthologies, which is always going to form the basis of the topic of her talk tonight. Lisa, is there anything else I need to say about you? Your credentials run to light years.
Thank you. Let's just get to the talk. I think it'll be more fun to do that.
Let's go straight to you. Yeah.
All right, great. All right, now, I need someone to share. Let me share my screen.
Yep. Okay. So do I need to do that?
The host has to enable
you should be able to now, Lisa. Yeah.
Okay, let me try again. Yeah, it looks like this will work. All right, hang on here. And for some reason, I am not seeing anything. Huh. Oh, wait a second. Okay. Great. Let's see if this takes care of it now. For some reason, it's not letting me share my desktop. Let me see here. Why?
Something I need to do? No. I've got something host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah. There's always something, right? So let's see here if I can figure it out, because I'd really like to. I have images, and it will be a much more fun talk if we can get to my images. So the things that we should have, I don't know why it's. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Paul, I actually sent you a copy of my slides. Do you think that we could see if you can pull them up?
Okay, on my email.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see.
I've just made you co-host, Paul, as well, so you should be able to share.
Okay. Let's quickly.
Let's see here, unless.
Sure.
Wait a second, I might be able to do this now. Let me try. Let me see if I can screen share. No, it didn't work, shoot.
Okay, just a second.
Yeah.
Just
so sorry, everyone. First of all, let me just
say
hello.
That's okay, these things happen. That's fine, don't worry.
They do.
We'll sort it out one way or another.
I can talk without the pictures, but it's not nearly as fun.
Sure.
Oh, okay. We're just sorting it out here, I think. Yeah. So sorry about this. I'm trying to sort this out here. Oh Lord. Okay. Let's see what we've got here. See if I can share screen.
Oh, great, you got it.
Great. Okay. I'll expand that.
Wonderful. All right, great.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So Paul, can you just be my advancer, and I'll just say next?
Yeah,
Is that
you
okay?
tell me when
Thank you so much.
And I will. Yeah.
I actually sort of like it when someone else has to do the advancing. It makes me feel so powerful. I control other people. It's very exciting. It feels like science fiction or something, right? All right, let's try this again. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I really want to thank, of course, Paul and Kate for inviting me to start off the festivities at this conference. Paul for the bio and for tech support here. And of course, all of you for being here. I hope that wherever you are, you have something nice to eat or drink, and you can settle back for a few minutes. And I'm going to take you through about a little more than 80 years, more like 100 years of science fiction history in less than an hour, especially now since we had some some technical difficulties. Okay, if we can advance to the first slide. Thanks so much. All right, so so I started thinking about the relationship between gender, genre, and the science fiction anthology about 15 years ago when I published my first critical study of women's science fiction. And that's the book Galactic Suburbia that Paul had mentioned in my introduction. And one of the things that really struck me when I did it was that every editor I worked with in that process said, you know, this scholarly monograph is really cool, but what you really need to do is start recovering and bringing back these stories. They sound fascinating, but no one can get access to them because they're either in, you know, fans' collections or locked away in university archives. And that was a real watershed moment for me when I thought, like, why, yes, this is indeed something I want to do. And today, I think I'm really fortunate that I get to work with presses, including Wesleyan, MIT, and the Library of America on these kinds of recovery projects. And, and in particular, I had spent a lot of the pandemic and then the last year or so working on the newest Futures female anthology for the Library of America. At the same time, of course, even as I've been doing this editing, I've been fortunate that I get to keep working with all of you on scholarly anthologies. And that was one really fun thing about this conference is a lot of you are people whom I've either written for in your anthologies or you've written in some of my anthologies. So what a perfect community to be talking about this with here today. And in fact, I wanted to mention that, like I said, the last year I've been working on the Futures Female too, but I've also been working on the Rutledge Companion to Gender and Science Fiction, which I'm co-editing with Wendy Gay Pearson, Sonia Friche, and Karen Omri. And that'll be coming out in about a month. And yet we, oddly enough, still don't have the final cover art, but I did want to give, or the final cover design, but we've got the cover art, which I wanted to share with you here today because I think it's just really lovely. So enjoy. All right, good. So as I've been working on these books, it's given me a lot of time to hone my thinking about the anthology in particular as a key site for working out not just the conventions of science fiction as a genre, but in the ways in which those conventions are often both implicitly and explicitly gendered. Today, of course, I'm going to be taking you on a brief tour of that history. Much as promised in my abstract, I'm going to begin by quickly noting the long history of gender and genre and discussing the role of the science fiction anthology in creating the first decidedly Western, masculinist, and heteronormative, and white, of course, histories of science fiction in the 1940s and 50s. After that, I'm going to turn to a more sustained consideration of when and why this began to change in the 1970s and the legacy of science fiction anthologies that we have with us today. All right, so let's go ahead then and move on to the next slide. That's enough thesis. I don't need to preview more of it. We'll get to it here. All right, great. So I want to start by noting, of course, that fantastic fictions about the relations of science, society, and gender are obviously as old as speculative storytelling itself. Looking backwards, we could begin this history in the 10th century AD with the folkloric tale Kaguya Hime, in which a princess from the moon rejects courtship by Japan's emperor for the company of her own people. So a very early tale of female self-determination. We could also, of course, begin our history, or at least take a stop and celebrate British author Margaret Cavendish for the 1666 proto-novel, The Blazing World, which casts the author Margaret Cavendish as a dimension-traveling philosopher warrior queen who uses an alien army to save her homeland from invasion. And then before she heads back out into outer space, indulges in a quick mental menage a trois with her Earth self and her Earth self's husband. It's great stuff. You should check it out. Finally, of course, we all want to, of course, recognize Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein, which gave us both our first modern science fiction archetypes, the mad scientist, the misunderstood monster, and the persecuted love interest, as well as the first modern critique of patriarchal science as being dangerously unmoored from feminine and feminist sensibilities. Next slide. Of course, speculative explorations of gender and genre really took off in the late 19th and early 20th century as science fiction developed into a unique popular genre, complete with its own authors and editors and publishing venues and guidelines for good writing. At the same time, of course, women writers in particular were inspired by the suffrage movement, which was encouraging women to seek equality in a variety of fields, including genre writing. And what you find is, especially right in the last part of the 1800s and the very first part of the 1900s, feminist writers from around the world staked claims for themselves in this newly developing genre, with techno-utopian stories celebrating women's work as engineers of better futures for all. And really quickly, just three of my favorite examples of this include Rokeya Hossain's The Sultana's Dream, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, and of course, Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood. And while the first two novels are especially exciting because they celebrate women as domestic engineers who use cutting-edge genetic and solar technologies to create better futures for themselves and their sisters, Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood, as many of you know, of course, imagines a high-tech, hidden, ancient African city powered by blue and green technologies, and of course, defended by an elite squad of warrior women. And if you're thinking, gosh, that sounds a lot like Wakanda, 60 years before anyone actually named Wakanda, you are correct. Now, by the 1920s and 30s, women writers, including Claire Winger Harris, who's all the way up in your right-hand corner, and then Leslie F. Stone in the middle, and Lilith Lorraine all the way at the bottom, amazed the nascent science fiction magazine community with astounding tales of daring lady astronauts, telepathic alien queens, and self-reliant love interests who have the pesky habit of rescuing themselves. Such stories did not go unnoticed. Later in life, Stone recalled that Hugo Gernsback in particular quite liked the idea of women invading the field he had opened. At the same time, both she and Lilith Lorraine recall that there were a loud minority of largely young white male fans who were less than happy about that turn of events. For example, in 1938, a young Donald G. Turnbull declared in a letter to Astounding that science fiction magazines should focus on, quote unquote, good, wholesome, free from women stories, because a woman's place is not in anything scientific. In a later issue, a teenaged Isaac Asimov agreed that, quote, what we want in science fiction is we don't want swooning dames, and that many top-notch, grade A, wonderful, marvelous, et cetera, authors get along just swell without any women. In some ways, of course, you might be thinking, this sounds a lot like some of the debates we've seen within the science fiction community in the last decade or so. And I'd say that you're absolutely right about that. And that's something we can return to later on in this talk or afterwards. All right, let's move forward to the next slide. Now, of course, what's really interesting I found in this time period as I've been working on recovering women's science fiction from this era is that debates over gender and genre weren't confined to just a few fans who happened to be the loudest voices in the room, but were actually very much central to the way the fledgling science fiction community was beginning to represent itself and define itself through the science fiction anthology. Now, as probably many of you already know, magazines were very much the center of science fictional innovation in the first part of the 20th century. And to a certain extent, I think it's fair to argue that science fiction came of age as a unique, popular genre in the magazine culture, and especially American magazine culture of that era. Having said that, by the 1940s, anthologies were on the rise in terms of popularity for a few different reasons. First of all, suddenly the field was big enough that no one could actually read everything that was associated with it. And so people felt like they needed a kind of guide through the field. And I think that that's still a really important function for anthologies today. Other things were that adult readers really appreciated anthologies because they were less fragile and kept in print longer and could be found in public libraries. So it was easier to access them than it might be if you were otherwise hoping to grab them off the newsstand when they came around. Finally, of course, anthologies were more acceptable to the parents of young readers, which was very important in an era when there were strict decency codes that often led to situations where science fiction magazines were deemed as having too lurid of covers for young viewers. And so they were stored under the counter with pornography. But no one thought the anthologies were pornography. That made everything so much better, right? Okay. So in 1946, we have the publication of the first two major science fiction anthologies, Raymond J. Healy and Francis J. McComas's Adventures in Time and Space, and Groff Conklin's The Best of Science Fiction. These were hardbound books from prestigious publishers that seemed to signal that science fiction was a serious genre and here to stay. And yet, it seemed in some ways that the teenage fans had won, and that science fiction really could get along just swell without women. At this point in time, women comprised about 15% of all contributors to the professional science fiction community. And these two anthologies were massive and contained literally scores and scores of stories. Yet, having said that, Conklin included just 2 women in his collection, Leslie F. Stone and C.L. Moore, and Healy and McComas included just Moore. Interestingly, both sets of editors further minimized the impact of women on the genre, because by 1946, Moore was a really well-established author in her own right, and yet she's only represented in both anthologies through one collaborative story written with her husband, Henry Kuttner, and published under the male pseudonym of Louis Paget. And of course, and nowhere in either anthology do they mention that C.L. Moore is C.L. Moore, it's just represented as Paget. Meanwhile, Stone's gender was erased by Conklin, who thought that she was a man. And in fact, the way that Stone herself learned this was that there was a launch party for the best of science fiction, and she couldn't make it to the party, so she sent her husband in her stead. And Conklin immediately assumed that he was Leslie Stone and started talking about what a great writer he was. And Stone's husband's like, no, I'm Mr. Stone. That's Leslie Stone, my wife. To which Conklin apparently blurted out, "Are you telling me I used a story by a woman? I didn't believe women could write science fiction." Now, this seems to me like an odd claim for someone who grew up in the magazines where Stone was publishing. And as you saw in my last slide, all those pictures I showed you were the pictures of authors that were published with their stories in amazing and thrilling wonder tales. So to not somehow know that Leslie Stone was a female, even though she had those pictures published with her, either suggests that editors like Conklin had a very specific reading pattern that didn't involve many of the major magazines, or that there was a sort of willful forgetting. All right. Now, even as women took over started to take on work as anthology editors in their own right, their contributions to the field were often marginalized or dismissed. So for example, when Judith Merrill launched her critically acclaimed Year's Best Science Fiction Anthology series, which ran from 1956 to 1967, and which other editors often described as the most nearly flawless anthology series ever produced, jealous male colleagues revived the complaints of earlier fans and once again anticipated our own era's sad puppies by casting Merrill as the head of a quote unquote science fiction mafia who threatened to ruin the fun of the genre by imposing literary standards essentially alien to the field on them. Now, one thing I will say is that it's important to recognize that this kind of backlashy feminist attitude was not exclusive or unique in any way to the science fiction community at this time. The 1930s, the 1950s are often seen as a sort of low point in feminist history, a moment when the demands of the Great Depression and World War II and then the Cold War seemed to usurp the needs of feminists, especially since it already seemed that feminism had done its job by securing the vote for at least white women in much of the world. Fortunately, we see both culture at large and the science fiction community begin to change. And this is when we're going to switch slides. Or we'll stay in the 50s forever, which seems horrible. Oh, go back. There we go. Perfect. Right. So here we go. When it changed, we're up to, okay, we've got conference title, right? Excellent. Right. So conversations about gender, genre, and the science fiction anthology begin to change in the 1960s and 70s due to a series of interrelated aesthetic and political factors. This era sees a really important shift in science fiction publishing patterns as authors of experimental, or what sometimes was known as new wave science fiction, began to place their most groundbreaking work in the original story collections that were very quickly replacing magazines as the center of generic innovation. So the kinds of collections that were displacing magazines at this time included Damon Knight's Orbit, let's see what else, Robert Silverberg's New Dimensions, Terry Carr's Universe, and of course, Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions. All of these anthologies were celebrated by authors and to a certain extent by critics, not only because they were showcasing the best work, but because they were high paying, perceived as very prestigious, and also perceived as very selective. So this was supposed to be the best of the best we're publishing in these anthologies. And given how many of them there were, each of those lines, many of them had like dozens of books in them. There must have been a lot of people writing the best science fiction out there, which is cool. Now, what's interesting is that women still comprise just about 15% of the science fiction community at this point, but all of a sudden they became a lot more visible within the field, taking home 19% of all Hugo Awards and 25% of all Nebula Awards in the 1970s, and often for stories that were published in those new wave anthologies. As Pamela Sargent noted once, the atmosphere of change that was heralded by the new wave attracted women to the genre because it suddenly seemed that their stories were, quote, likely to find a more receptive audience, even if they violated some of the traditional canons. And in fact, inspired by the revival of feminism and the recovery of women's science fiction, of women's history in the new gender studies programs that were developing all around the world at that time, we start to see women in science fiction creating their first anthologies of their own. This includes, of course, groundbreaking works like Sargent's own Women of Wonder anthology series, which spawned a series of sequels through the 80s and 90s. And the first book in particular, I think is really important because it's actually one of the very first herstories of women's science fiction from the pulp era to the present. And in some ways is a very important corrective to those 1946 anthologies that erased women from the field. Other important anthologies that came out in this time included Virginia Kidd's Millennial Women, in which all the stories are written by women and have female protagonists. It was the first anthology of its kind to do that. We also had Vonda McIntyre and Susan Janice Anderson's Aurora Beyond Equality, which offers readers visions of the many truly strange new futures that we might inhabit once we actually achieve gender equality. And if you've ever read either McIntyre or Anderson talk about this book, they said it was actually really, really difficult to solicit stories for it because apparently no one can imagine beyond equality. But they try, and there's a good thing. And then finally, even though this technically isn't a science fiction anthology, I want to give a shout out to Jessica Amanda Salmon's Amazon's anthology, which in some ways started to do for women in fantasy writing, what these other anthologies were doing in science fiction. And I mean, it's also cool because as some of you might know, Samuelson actually has close ties to the science fiction community of the 1960s and 70s. She actually edited the award-winning fanzine, the magazine of fantasy and terror, in the early 1970s under her dead name, and then transitioned in the mid 70s and chronicled her transition in other important science fiction fanzines like Mom's Apple Pie. And then ended up, for whatever reason, completely leaving science fiction because she loves Amazons. To this day, she still loves Amazons. It's great. You should all join her social media feeds. It's full of Amazons and goddesses. It's amazing. So shout out to that. Okay, cool. All right. In the early 1970s, it's interesting to note that all of these women actually had quite a bit of support from the science fiction community. Both Brian Aldiss and Harlan Ellison went on record saying that the best writers in SF today are the women. Isaac Asimov, who, as some of you know, was a problematic figure and often called, the doctor of 1,000 fingers, I believe, for his habit of groping people. But even he had to admit that Anne McCaffrey's status as a New York Times bestseller meant that women were indeed a legitimate part of the science fiction community. I believe what he said is you can't argue with that kind of money. And then, of course, at the end of the 1970s, Robert Silverberg gave the editorial reins of his prestigious New Dimension series to Marta Randall. Joan Vinci has a marvelous interview where she recalls being very proud of her male counterparts in this time period, feeling that in many ways, the men of the science fiction community were moving towards thinking about gender in new ways a little bit more quickly than the rest of the United States and even maybe perhaps the rest of the world. But then sadly, I have to say very quickly that backlash against feminism reared its ugly head once again. In the 1980s, as feminist backlash once again swept the United States, swept Europe, and swept the science fiction community. Silverberg, a year after handing over his series to Marta Randall, Silverberg threatened to completely shut down the series if Randall actually did the all-female issue she was promising to deliver. Asimov sexually molested Randall while she was the SFWA president in the Khan suite. And apparently Randall said it was a good thing other people were in the room to wrestle him down, or Asimov might have come out a limb or two from that one. And then, of course, Bruce Sterling infamously claimed that nothing important happened in 1970s science fiction, thereby promoting cyberpunk at the expense of feminism and erasing the achievements of an entire generation of women writers. As some of you might know, this actually prompted leading feminist fan Jean Gamal to write her infamous open letter to Joanna Russ, in which she despairingly concludes that she has yet another item to add to Russ's list of strategies used by men to discredit women's literary accomplishments. It's not that they didn't really write it, or that they had any help, or that they could only do it once, but that they did it, and it was a boring fad. Next slide. Boring fad or not, women continued to stake claims for themselves in our imaginary futures. And what we find is over the past 4 decades, they've used new feminist ideas about gender and society to produce new generations of science fiction story anthologies that very much expand our ideas about who counts as both a science fiction artist and a citizen of the future. In 1987, Kimberly Crenshaw had coined the term intersectionality to help other feminists understand that women's experience of gender was not universal, but dependent on the complex and sometimes contradictory relations of both race and gender. This is a notion that's taken up in science fiction very quickly, and by the turn of the millennia, women would become leaders in producing new science fiction anthologies organized around these ideas of intersectionality, including, of course, Cherie Thomas's Dark Matter series, Andrea L. Bell and Yolanda Molina Gavilan's Cosmos Latinos, Grace Dillon's Walking the Clouds, and Noreen Dorman's Terra Incognita. And I think that insofar as these anthologies collect stories by authors of color who aren't usually found in traditional Euro-Western science fiction publishing venues, they ask us to reconsider not just who writes science fiction, but where it's written as well. Next slide. In a similar vein, LGBTQ+ authors have generated resistant and transformative science fiction histories of their own, with anthologies including Nicola Griffith and Stephen Paget's Bending the Landscape, which is now very old, but still a great anthology if you can find it. Absolutely groundbreaking for its time. Britt Mandela's Beyond the Gender Binary, Joshua Whitehead's Love After the End, and Paula Grand's Far Out. The fact that these collections begin to appear in the 1990s, I think, is no surprise. After nearly 100 years of 150 years of identity politics that treated women as united by their biology and their experience of heteronormative identity, third wave feminists of the 1990s were beginning to actually acknowledge a diversity of sexual identities. This occurred across culture as scholars such as Judith Butler and Teresa de Lauretis paid homage to the energy of queer art and activism with concepts such as gender performance and queer theory. And as popular artists like Bikini Kill singer Kathleen Hanna celebrated new modes of feminist art that could help us, quote, figure out how bullshit like racism, able-bodiedism, ageism, speciesism, classism, thinism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and heterosexism figures in our own lives. Taken together, I think that many of the stories in these anthologies absolutely dramatize these concepts and are very much part of a moment where we first begin to insist that queer identities should be studied not somehow as deviations from some sort of normative heterosexual identity, but on their own terms as important identities in their own right. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, now this 1970s marked not just a shift in science fiction storytelling, but in the rise of science fiction studies as a unique scholarly discipline of its own. Not surprisingly, women were quick to start doing feminist work in this area as well. And in fact, many of the feminist authors who published their first stories in this era also generated some of the first science fiction scholarship. Obviously, we all know that Joanna Russ is an important figure here. We're here to celebrate her foundational work and that of other people in this kind of field. So we might think about Joanna Russ, her landmark essay, The Image of Women in Science Fiction from 1970, which argued that there are plenty of images of women in science fiction, but hardly any women. And Ursula Le Guin's American SF and the Other, which depicted science fiction as, quote, a baboon patriarchy with rich, ambitious, aggressive males at the top, and then at the bottom, the poor, the uneducated, the faceless masses, and all the women. Now, early studies by authors like Russ and Le Guin appeared in a variety of venues, everywhere from art magazines such as Red Clay Reader to scholarly to the new science fiction journals like Extrapolation. It's also, though, the era that marks the first feminist science fiction critical anthology, surprise, surprise, Marlene Barr's Future Females, A Critical Anthology from 1981. And that particular collection, as some of you know, spawned a series of other anthologies, including Future Females, The Next Generation, and Afro-Future Females, Black Writers Chart Science Fiction's newest new wave trajectory. Finally, I'd want to point out that this era also saw the beginning of the serious study of sexuality in genre fiction with Eric Garber and Lynn Palio's Uranian Worlds. All right, next slide. As the trajectory of BAR's anthologies indicate, I think, over the half-past century, science fiction scholars, much like their artistic counterparts, really have become increasingly interested in expanding our ideas about gender in science fiction. By the 1980s and 90s, new communication and information technologies, coupled with the advent of global capitalism, led a whole new generation of feminists to propose that science and technology weren't just one area of life that women could maybe dismiss or connect just with some sort of masculine activity we don't have to worry about, but that instead these were probably the most important forces in everyone's lives right now, and that it was absolutely essential for women to start thinking through those issues. This is an argument, of course, that was advanced especially by science and technology scholar Donna Haraway, who appropriated the figure of the part organic, part technological cyborg from science fiction as an ideal metaphor for modern political activists, right? And she argued that feminist science fiction authors in particular were our storytellers for exploring what it means to be embodied in high-tech worlds. They are our theorists for cyborgs. This notion is, of course, very much at the heart of much feminist science fiction scholarship from that era as well. And we see it especially in anthologies like Takayuki Tatsumi's Cyborg Feminism, Jenny Womark's Cybersexualities, and many of the essays in a more recent volume, Carola Moultrie's Gendered Future, on the transformation of feminist visions in science fiction. And I've obviously put the German original up here for those of you who'd be interested in that, but then read it through in English because German is not my strong suit, and I don't want to trip over words and embarrass you and myself, mostly me. All right, so obviously this kind of work continues today with two volumes in particular that I think are definitely worth checking out. Cheryl Vint and Samaria Buran's edited collection, Technologies of Feminist Speculative Fiction, and Ramona Anis, Anna Palladino, and Manuela Spinelli's Feminist Science Fiction, Imagining Gender in Contemporary Italian Culture. Next slide. Almost there, friends. Hang in there. Have another drink. I'm going to stop and have a drink too, but just water. I'll have my drink afterwards. All right. Okay. So, next slide. There we go. Perfect. Great. Like their literary peers, feminist scholars also produce anthologies of criticism dedicated to intersectionality in science fiction. And honestly, I think I'm not going to surprise anyone here if I say that I really think this is one of the most robust areas of feminist science fiction and maybe science fiction inquiry in general today. So collections, pioneering collections in this vein include Wendy Gay Pearson, Jo Gordon, and Veronica Hollinger's Queer Universes, Catherine Josephina and Merla Watson, and B.V. Olgun's Altermundos is a nice contemporary counterpart to Queer Universes. I also think if you want to look at how people are doing intersectional studies in transmedia studies, that Anne Gvelsik and Ricky Schubart's Women of Ice and Fire is a marvelous example of feminist science fiction transmedia studies. And finally, while most anthologies of feminist science fiction criticism are indeed published by academics working through academic presses, I want to give a special shout out to Aqueduct Press, which has been a feminist science fiction press that's just been contributing to feminist scholarship for years now with the 11-volume WisCon Chronicles series. And that ran from 2007 to 2017, was edited by authors and scholars, including L. Timmel Deschamps and Rebecca Holden and Jamie Go. As an archive of the various events that have taken place at WisCon, which if you've never gone, it's the world's largest and oldest feminist science fiction convention, and I absolutely recommend it. I was really lucky to work with WisCon when I was going to graduate school in Wisconsin. You really must do so. And each of these anthologies, if you haven't been there, they'll give you a sense of the flavor, although not maybe all of the excitement and energy. But you'll get to see some of the conversations that have unfolded amongst the scholars and fans and authors and artists who attend. including feminism, race, revolution in the future, shattering ableist narratives, and intersections and alliances. All right, next slide. And then finally, one last strand of feminist science fiction scholarship that often is expressed through anthologies that I'd love to call people's attention to is this tradition of honoring feminist foremothers in the science fiction anthology, right? So early collections in this vein, in the 1980s, women started to put together anthologies that focused specifically on women's contributions to the utopian tradition, such as Barbara Holland Kunz's feminist utopias, The Dawn of a Post-Patriarchal Society, and Jane Donilworth and Carol Cole Merton's Utopian and Science Fiction by Women, Worlds of Difference. Meanwhile, the feminist scholars featured in Helen Merrick's Women of Other Worlds celebrate the accomplishments of women in science fiction proper, while those appearing in Robert Reed's Greenwood Encyclopedia of Women in Science Fiction and Fantasy, and yay, I'm in that one, I'm very excited. Go read all the essays. You don't have to just read mine, but it's a marvelous book. And it offers both surveys of major topics in science fiction studies and focused examinations of specific authors and literary traditions. Finally, the past several decades have seen the publication of collections honoring the accomplishments of pioneering feminist science fiction icons, both real and imagined. This includes Farah Mendelssohn's On Joanna Russ from 2012, and more recently, Linda Majewski and Tanya D. Zook's Our Blessed Rebel Queen, essays on Carrie Fisher and Princess Leia. All right, last slide, please. All right, so we're back to the images from the beginning, everyone, and my apologies, because I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about in conclusion, and then I figured it out about 5 minutes before the conference started here. So these were my placeholder images, and you'll just have to imagine as I talk what other images I might have put in. But this is good too. Enjoy my book covers. I think that they're really lovely. I didn't design them, so I can say they're lovely. I'm very pleased with the people who did. Anyways, so here's what I want to talk about. So why does all of this matter? Like, why should we care about the history of gender and genre in the science fiction anthologies? And it has to do, right, with sort of something I keep coming back to, the way that we keep, every time we see some movement forward, especially in feminist activity in the science fiction community, as in the real world, it's often met with a kind of backlash, right? And as anyone who's been even half awake and part of the science fiction community for the past maybe decade and a half knows, many of the gains that have been made by minority voices in the genre lately and in culture at large have once again been met with backlash. The increasing visibility of women, queer, and artists of color in the 21st century global science fiction community has led to hateful events, including the Racefail 09 flame war, the Gamergate controversy of 2014, and the block voting controversies of Puppygate 2015 and 2016. And in each case, this should be sounding familiar by now, we see a relatively small group of often US born, often white, and often heterosexual men loudly, and unfortunately, this time around, in some cases violently, proclaiming that women and queer artists, especially those of color, are out to ruin the fun of popular culture for everyone by insisting on exploring issues of diversity and social justice and experimenting with the genre form itself. And yet, women and queer artists continue to thrive across science fiction, media, and cultures today. I don't want to end on the negative note, because I think one thing that we see is that even as this kind of backlash resurfaces, the feminist community and its ally communities continue to grow. And at this point are really, I think, the groups that have the culture, both in terms of the awards and in terms of really largely what gets written about and talked about across culture, right? So for instance, we might think about how Margaret Atwood's award-winning Handmaid's Tale began as a 1980s feminist dystopia, has spun out obviously into a not very successful movie from the 90s and a wildly successful TV series of the 2000s. But even more importantly, how those iconic red handmaids uniforms have become iconic symbols of political protest across the US and really across the globe. We might also think about the way the Wachowski sisters' Matrix film series eviscerates Western culture's most dearly held beliefs about the singular male chosen one while meditating on the power of women, minority communities, and trans consciousness. Can also think of Jeanette Eng's 2019 Hugo Awards speech from Dublin Worldcon, celebrating science fiction as a wonderful ramshackle genre, even that's outgrown the limiting influence of mid-century tastemakers like Asimov and Campbell, who were responsible for setting a tone of science fiction that still haunts the genre today. Eng says, right, sterile, male, white, exulting in the ambitions of imperialists and colonizers, settlers and industrialists. And yet, meanwhile, the global science fiction community has sent a firm message to the architects of Puppygate by giving the Hugo Award for Best Novel of 2016, 2017, and 2018 to African-American author N.K. Jemisin for her Broken Earth trilogy, thereby making her the first author of any race or gender to win that prestigious award 3 times in a row. And just because I need to bring this back to anthologists, I would point out that the anthologists have very much been involved in this last round of skirmishes too, about who controls the future of our imagination and of our science fiction, right? Soon after the puppy controversies unfolded, actually once Gamergate started to unfold, the editors of Lightspeed, Nightmare, and Fantasy magazines kicked off their Destroy Science Fiction project, a series of special issues featuring the speculative art and writing of women, queer people, and people of color. In other words, all the people who are out to destroy the fun of science fiction for us, right? And so really, I want to end then again on a positive note, and that even as we go through these cycles, we want to note that increasingly we see that all people of all genders and all races really do want to see women and queer heroes remaking the world in their own image. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that okay if I stop sharing? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Great. Thank you. So then I want to check in the chat, or I should have said, if you want to raise questions in the chat, yeah. Katie, thankfully, as ever, has bailed me out. If there's any questions that you want to give to Lisa, please do so. Whilst you do so, I've now got to think about a question myself, probably. Oh, we've got right, just Kate. So Kate Koji says no questions, just love and enthusiasm. Which is exactly
well, if people have recommendations, how about recommendations? If anyone has recommendations for like cool anthologies I've left out, right? Because I mean, I'm one brain here. I can only do so much, and so if anyone's got other great like anthologies, I'd love to know about them.
That'd be cool.
Yes, Daughters of Earth is a great one, of course.
Yes. So I mean, I
would have liked it even if it wasn't, because it's Justine Larbalestier who's the amazing person behind that, right?
Yeah. I just want actually I'm just going to very quickly double check our times. Make sure.
Oh, it's I think we have about 5.
We got that's cool. We're cool. We got the quarter of an hour here, which is cool. So yeah. So please, anybody wants to put questions in the chat, please do so. I kind of think also about, you raised one question which I think is interesting, but where the early anthologies were being published by mainstream presses like Random House and so on, and I'm just wondering about do we still see that? Do we still see anthologies coming out from mainstream presses, or anthologies mainly coming out from small presses? What's the kind of sort of publishing sort of platforms being used here?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, of course, I think the big change right from the 1940s to the 2020s is that there is a robust science fiction publishing tradition in the United States, in much of Europe, and increasingly in other parts of the world, right, as well. Japan has a really robust tradition. China has a robust tradition. Parts of like South Africa and Kenya have pretty robust tradition, right, have robust tradition. So we're seeing this everywhere, and even places that don't, you see people pooling. The nice thing about digital technologies is authors from around the world can pool their resources to bring together anthologies or other collections that get their work out. And that's been really exciting. So that's one of the big differences, is that there is both a formal science fiction publishing community in a way that there wasn't before. Doubleday and Crown were throwing their hats into the ring in a bid to become some of the first science fiction publishers. And that's what that was related to. So of course today we have both popular presses that do science fiction anthologies, specialized ones, and scholarly presses. But the big difference today, 2 things I think, is that, well, 3 things. First of all, digital publishing changes the landscape, and I think provides a greater gateway and allows people who might not otherwise be able to get their voices out or get them out quickly to publish, right? So, and in particular, small independent presses, one of the things that's interesting, right, is that we went through a moment when we went into digital technologies where authors thought about just moving to self-publishing models and print-on-demand models. And to a certain extent, people are still doing that. But what I'm seeing that's much more exciting is small presses, our authors putting together small presses with their friends through Kickstarters and throwing their hat in the ring that way. So Bill Campbell's Rosarium Press started out, right, as a small minority science fiction press, and now is a pretty healthy sized small press, right, that does quite well and is really establishing a name for itself, not just bringing us American authors of color, but authors of color from all over the globe, as well as allies, which is really cool. And then here in Atlanta, we have MV Media, which is run by Milton Davis. And Davis is one of the founders of Sword and Soul Fiction, along with Charles Saunders, and also one of the founding members of the cyberpunk movement. And we've just, and a new movement, Atlanta Futurism, learn more about it. I'm part of that group too. It's very cool. But what he does is, as he helps spearhead these movements, right, he brings together authors and publishes them through this small press. And it works well because this way he can get networks of both very famous authors who can use some of their cultural capital to sort of broadcast out what's happening at these smaller presses. And it also becomes a way for young, or not even young, but sometimes older or very old up and coming authors to share their work as well. And then one last thing really quickly, we still do have a few mainstream literary presses who are publishing science fiction work. And in fact, right, I want to give a shout out to my publisher, Library of America, is I think really leading the way in that respect. Though Library of America was originally, it's a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the best of American letters. And historically that meant high canonical literature by dead people. So because dead people don't ask for copyright, they're off copyright usually, right? But also because there was this tradition to preserve. But what happened was in the 2010s, as the publishing industry began to shrink again or to contract again, many publishers decided to drop and condense their lines, but Library of America decided to go in the opposite direction and to expand their lines and to include popular culture under the rubric of American letters. So that's been an exciting opportunity to bring back not just science fiction authors, but fantasy authors through some of the fantasy collections that they've done, and crime writers, women crime writers who were wildly popular, right, in the 1940s, but most people don't remember them. But now you can read them in these beautiful hardbound editions.
Right.
Which still have prestige, just like they did in the 40s. You know, people love the big, heavy books. Yeah, they do.
Great. We got a suggestion and we got a question. So a suggestion first is from Taryn Taylor, who says just sort of a cool anthology that just got my Kickstarter form. Just came. Would be interested in Vudenauts present, I think, or Vudenauts present, reliving mythology. So that's Taryn's suggestion. Katie has a question though, which is, can you speak about the work of digging into the archives and reviving earlier anthologies?
And reviving earlier anthologies.
Reviving earlier anthologies.
Interesting. Okay. So you mean in terms of finding older anthologies and figuring out what to do with them? That's actually...
I'm guessing so.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
cool. Yes. Yeah, so right, I mean, that's actually an interesting question because I didn't really get into it in my introduction, but that's literally the tension between different kinds of anthologies. It's sort of what launched me into this project in the first place. When I first got to Georgia Tech, like I said, I was handed the history of science fiction class, and I had all kinds of great ideas for what to do post 60s and 70s because like that's what I grew up in, right? And I knew the earlier science fiction, but I'm kind of like, I don't want to teach the same 5 people I keep seeing in anthologies. And I thought, surely there have to be more people out there. And I was really lucky because at Georgia Tech, we have a really big science fiction collection. We're actually one of the top 20 collections in the world. And we were especially strong in hardcover books, which means we have all the old anthologies essentially. And that was great because I had been looking at like the big high level anthologies, like the ones I showed you all, like A Treasury of Science Fiction, Jim Gudd's Road to Science Fiction. And these are all great, amazing, amazing sets of anthologies, but they sort of were telling the same sets of history of the same sets of people from different perspectives. And then I thought, well, weren't there year's best anthologies then? Because I remembered seeing those in my parents' house when I grew up, because my parents are both science fiction dorks. And so I went into the collection and like my mind was blown because I started looking at not the big historical review anthologies, but the much finer grained anthologies, the year's best of science fiction and fantasy, year's best of galaxy. And all of a sudden, a very different landscape unfolded. And it turned out there were a lot of women in the field, and a surprising number, and who were getting like amazing props from the editors, who were like, oh, this science fiction told from a sensitive woman's point of view is incredible. And, you know, we might not love that kind of terminology now, but like people were super psyched about this stuff that like the housewife heroine stuff that Judith Merrill was writing. And there was a great deal of respect in the tone of these editors for these women. And I just thought, well, where have they been all my life? And that's sort of what launched it off. So yeah, it's important to go into the archives to look for not just the original publications in the magazines, but the original and the smaller anthologies that maybe haven't been republished or aren't as easy to access as well.
Have we got any other questions in the chat? Anybody else wants to ask a question? We still got 5 minutes or so here. Whilst anybody's just thinking of other questions, I mean, there's also an issue here which is also about the kind of the politics of the anthology and the way in which the anthology is thinking through a process of canonization. Do you get a sense of some of these early anthologies that are already beginning to try and canonize, already trying to begin to shape a history? Or is it just more of a snapshot moment? It's just the year's best.
Yeah.
That's it. Or is there a sense of kind of a kind of more greater consciousness, as it were? So,
I think that the large anthologies, like the sort of big historical review ones or the big omnibus ones, absolutely had that agenda for sure. And it makes sense because it was sort of, right, this is the moment that the science fiction community in the 40s turns outward and goes, at least in the United States, from being a sort of disreputable genre, right, that had to be hidden away with the pornography. And that really appealed to a very small group of people, to a much more, it became culturally central to the American and I think the global imagination. And in part, right, that has to do with World War II. And the fact that as the New York Times itself said, right, that all of a sudden all those crazy stories about nuclear technologies and computers from the 1920s and 30s and 40s seemed to be not by madmen and madwomen, but by, this was the quote, prophets proven right by the course of events. And so I think there was a sort of sense that this is an important genre and we have to build an important history for it. And that would make sense, especially within the United States context, because throughout the US after World War II, right, that was the first time the US was a global world power. And the US engaged in a massive project of shaping its and presenting its own history in very specific ways. So it feels like it's very much part of that moment to make those kinds of gestures. In terms of the smaller, like the year's best anthologies, I get less the sense that those are about making history, at least until Judith Merrill takes over. And then I think when Merrill takes over, they are 100% about making history. I think that for the day-to-day editors of the magazines, Boucher and Horace Gold over at Galaxy, and even Campbell at Astounding, that, you know, this was a way to promote your magazine and promote the genre, but it wasn't the main activity. Whereas for Merrill, it became her weapon against a culture that wanted to dismiss her as the little mother of science fiction.
Fantastic. Let's see. Do we have any other questions coming through on the chat? Let's see. We got a comment here from Chucky Pompatel. In these early anthologies, is there any notable difference between renowned and editing choices between publishers from different nations? Is the question that Chucky says.
Yes. Well, a lot of the early, yes, I think that's there is a difference. So as you might imagine, especially in the 40s and 50s and even maybe through the 60s or 70s, American anthologies dominate. In the study I've done, we start to see anthologies go with some the American publishers seem to dominate the anthology publication process. There are obviously some British and French presses that are doing this as well. But you really start to see this expand in the 1980s and 1990s. I know that when I was looking through this history that I gave you, there's a really sharp shift that happens around 1980 where all of a sudden, like, 1 out of every 5 anthologies is clearly being published in another language and by people from other nations. So is there a difference in prestige from them, though? That's a really good question, and not one that I can really have a good answer to off the top of my head. I think that I think it depends whether you're talking about science fiction story collections or science fiction scholarly anthologies. With scholarly anthologies, I think that, scholars like to think of themselves as an international crew, just like scientists do, and that we can all contribute knowledge equally. So I know personally, I'm very excited when I find anthology collections or book collections that are not out of the United States, to get that kind of funhouse mirror to my own world, if nothing else. Within the science fiction community, I think that we've seen an increasing emphasis on the value of publications from other countries, I'd say in the last decade or so. And that largely has to do with the shift to Web 2.0 and social media, right? That in many ways, we couldn't really, the pipeline, it was tight. It was hard to get things from other cultures. And often, one thing I know from doing this history is that there were countries like Italy for a long time wouldn't even publish Italian science fiction authors. They only published the American authors because that's all that people wanted to read, right? But you do definitely see a shift by the 1980s that people are beginning to embrace their own sort of cultural traditions. And then again, by the 2000s, we have the technology to really start disseminating things across culture. And right, that's part of why we start to see that kind of backlash across science fiction, is because the 2010s is the moment when science fiction can go global again because it's digital. And all of a sudden, you do have anthologies like Ivor Hartman's Afro SF anthology coming out of Africa all of a sudden out of nowhere. And not out of nowhere, because there's a ton of people doing science fiction across the continent, but it feels surprising to people that suddenly these anthologies are coming up and being published outside, often outside the conventional publishing structures. So I think it's no surprise people have been anxious about them and excited about them all at once.
Yeah. I'm gonna quickly mention one anthology I just thought of, which was So Long Been Dreaming by Niall Hopkinson.
Yes, that's a great one.
But a quickie question I think is the one to finish on, though. This is from Andrew Butler, who asks, what anthology do you most want someone to edit?
Oh, I love that question. I have an answer for you. And then I found out it's actually just been edited, and it's like, I'm like literally in the process of buying it. But so with the fall of Roe versus Wade, after the sort of, days of screaming and agonizing, one of the things that occurred to me is that what I need to do is not just an anthology about the future being female, but about the reproductive future being female. And what I want to see are anthologies about thinking about right now about issues of reproduction in science fiction. And it's funny, I was just at Multiverse, a literary science fiction con that is hosted here in Atlanta. And I was in the author's room, and I was sitting next to 2 women who were like, after the fall of Roe, and they were hucking their anthology, and they said, after the fall of Roe versus Wade, we knew we screamed for 2 days, and then we knew we had to do something, and so we threw together as quickly as we could this anthology of reproductive futures. And I couldn't even buy one because by the time they explained it to me, they were gone. And so I'm on the wait list now until the next print comes out. Yeah, I'll figure out, I don't remember the title off the top of my head, Andrea, but I'll get it to Paul, and then he could share it with all of you.
Thank you so much.
So I want that. I want the reproductive future as female, and I'm willing to edit it. If anyone here wants to let me do that.
There's a statement. We're going to have to finish it there. Many thanks to Lisa Yaszek for kickstarting this conference. We're going to take a 10-minute break at this point, and when we come back, we'll be joining a session about the work of Vonda McIntyre with Una McCormack and Nicola Griffith and Nicey Shaw and just every amazing people, Kate McDonald and so on.
Yeah.
So see you back in about 10 minutes or so from now. Okay, cheers. Many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.